Hello everyone. So welcome to season 6 of Teh Tarik with Walid, and I wanted to thank everyone for your support, and hopefully we will continue to have good episodes, continue to have good conversations on politics and public policy. So today we'll be discussing an issue that, to be honest, I am not super familiar with, but it's an extremely important one of the biggest, an extremely important issue, one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge of our time, which is climate change. And we have two young activists, two young environmental activists, Singaporean activists, and they are both undergrads. Just full disclosure, one of them, Terese, was my student. She's still a student at NTO, as in I just don't see her around. I'm sure she's still on campus, I just don't see her around that much because she's busy with activism or she's not doing my classes, but she was my student. And Kate is also an undergrad studying in the States, but she's not my student. Okay, so but I know both of them. So just a disclaimer, they approached me and asked me whether I wanted to discuss this topic. I'm more than happy, and that is also the case for anybody who wants to discuss any particular issue, and you can just approach me and then we see whether we can have an Instagram discussion on it. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Hello. So where you guys at now?
We're in Egypt.
Also, you are still at COP. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you explain to us, right, what is COP27? What are you guys doing there, and what's the significance of COP27?
Yeah. So COP27 basically stands for Conference of the Parties, and is the supreme decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was a document that many countries signed many years ago, I think in the 1990s. And then since then, every year they have this conference to discuss critical environmental issues, climate change, basically.
So this year is actually the first time that Singapore built a pavilion at COP.
We're here.
Yeah, we're inside one of the rooms
Wow.
right now. So it's like a space in the conference center that they built. And this is the first time they did it. So they actually invited a few young activists from Singapore to come along and run some programs or speak on panels. So that's how we got the chance to come. Yeah.
Okay, wow. So it is great that the government invited you guys.
They give us two party overflow badges. So yeah,
Yeah, that
Okay,
means
okay.
you can't be part of the delegation.
yeah.
Right. Okay.
But
So yeah.
people
Can
here.
Sorry?
Oh yeah, sorry. There are three people here because Kate's on an observer badge, so it's a different. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So young people can be equally inspiring and infuriating. And I think you guys are pretty inspiring also to do what you do at such a young age. I mean, a lot of respect for that. So thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about and I really want to be educated on this issue as well. I don't know as much as I should. So what is the significance of our governments? By the way, for those who for those who are uninitiated, the Singapore government promised a net zero carbon policy by 2050. So what is the significance? Are you guys happy with that? Or like all activists, are you still unhappy with some aspects of it?
You just say all activists.
Okay, I think the number or the term net zero by 2050 gets thrown around a lot, and people don't realize it actually comes from a scientific basis, which basically the UN said that if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the entire globe has to reach net zero by 2050. That's why we see a lot of countries doing that. And so once you pass this point, it's when a lot of ecosystems kind of reach a tipping point, and climate impacts will be really just disastrous across the world. And so a lot of activists in Singapore have been calling for net zero by 2050, and I think it's very significant. I'm happy with it. I'm not sure about Tourette's.
I mean, I think it's a significant milestone also in our whole journey. Initially, there was no ambition to even have this kind of target, and then after we moved to having net zero by or around mid-century, and then finally we finalized those exact an exact concretely by 2050. So I feel like even though we may not have the exact trajectory on a concrete way on how we want to get there yet, at least having that back of mind consideration or having that target out there limits the kind of activities that we want to do in the future, limits the way we think about how we want to consider our policies, to consider environment or consider more of like economic considerations in the future. Hopefully.
Oh, that's a good segue into the next topic. But I just wanted to ask a little bit, because I saw this meme. I think I don't know whether Kate you shared it, or Terese, or maybe it's Chiyun who shared it. One of the three of you about explaining the graphics, explaining net zero and how you can buy the thing as well. Can you explain that a little?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so basically it's carbon credits, right? Because
Yes.
if, let's say, Singapore, we don't have space for renewable energy, and we still are reliant on companies like Shell and Exxon, or Jurong Island. So there's no way you can kind of fully cut your emissions to zero, right? You're still going to have a bit. So there's this thing called carbon credits, where basically, let's say we build a forest in Indonesia, they can use that amount of like emissions that we reduce in that forest and use it for Singapore. So even though your own country, like your emissions are still not at zero, it's still overall considered zero or net zero.
Because
Yeah.
you bought it.
Yeah, you bought like credits. So they're basically commodifying nature and making it tradable.
So like the money you got, the more you can pollute. And so it's not very equitable. Also,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask, the inequality behind climate activism, right? What happens to the global south, right? Which the global south is at a different level of development, right? It seems like, and I've been experiencing this, or I've been seeing this a lot with regard to the World Cup, not climate activism. I see that there's a resurgence of the white man's burden, right? They want to civilize the world, and I see this playing out in the World Cup, but I also see it playing out in the discussions on climate change, when the global north is talking about, the other countries need to do this, but then you also contributed to a lot of environmental pollution, degradation as your countries develop. Conveniently, once you're developed, then you're telling the others to. So how, as climate activists, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so like there's this a framework that's now being pushed out at the UN level called loss and damage finance. Alright, so like the idea is to get these countries who have been responsible for the historic emissions to pay up for what they what we call like owe to the developing countries for all that they are suffering today, right, because of the climate crisis. We all know that they are suffering disproportionate impacts of climate change because of certain, simply because of their own development trajectory. They are at a later stage, right? So this loss and damage finance is about getting these countries to pay using like public finance and also grant-based finance to these developing nations in order to cope with the impacts of climate change that are beyond what they can cope with.
So, Prof. Walid, you can tell us if it's getting too technical, because we've been living in COP.
Carry on. No, carry on. So if I can understand it, I think other people can understand it as well, because my knowledge about this is very little. So this loss and damage finance thing, that's interesting. So how is it gonna work? So it's like compensation.
I think they prefer not to use the words compensation because like there's something very touchy that the developed nations don't like. Ability of compensation, they try not to use it. But like essentially I think they want to set up like a finance facility at COP and at the UNFCCC level, so that like it's to guarantee a form of equitable access for everybody also, right? When you have it at the UN level, rather than having like private kind of bilateral the negotiations.
I think that's like the ideal situation, right? Where you have a pool of money that you can tap. If, let's say, your country is facing like crazy floods, like Pakistan, In reality, I think we've seen these 2 weeks. Like the US is the number one blocker of loss and damage at the moment. They're just not willing to compromise at all. So it may move into something that's a bit more of a compromise. Like there may be conditions attached to it, or it may be only accessible to certain countries. It's still yet to see how they're going to operationalize it.
Okay, thank you, Kate and Terese. There is a comment by an activist who is clearly not happy, Chun Hao. He said the definition of net zero is actually really broad and vague. That's why there are many interpretations of what it means and what it looks like. So there are a lot of creative solutions to decarbonize. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I feel like that's why also, right? Like after we announced net zero, like, okay, great. Like now what can we do from here? How can we ensure that that goal is actually realizable, or is it just going to be words on paper that we don't actually fulfill? Like, for example, the developed nations promised $100 billion in climate finance for like eternity already, and yet that has still not been fulfilled. So we want, now climate activists are calling for like concrete policies on how we can actually see that materializing and happening.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about that, right? The concrete policies. What are you guys suggesting, and how would you respond to the common accusation? Oh, the moment we do this, the economy is going to tank in Singapore. Singapore is a small country. We are not like the other big countries. We cannot, and we only contribute 0.2% to the global warming, whatever it is. But of course, by per capita, it's quite bad, right? We are one of the highest. But yeah, 0.2%. But for a small country, that's still significant, right? So how will you respond to that, the economic aspect of it?
I think we've heard this so many times before. And I think people have this misconception that like environmental activists are saying, oh, let's shut down Jurong Island tomorrow. Like, we are responsible people and we are calling not for like immediate shutdown, right? We are saying we need a transition and we have to at least start that process first. So that means like upskilling your workers in oil and gas and maybe moving them into renewable energy projects instead, or equipping them with new skills that they'll need. Right now, Singapore is we've barely started on that process. We are still investing or allowing the expansion of oil and gas or fossil fuels when the science clearly says that that's not possible. So I think that's the main thing that like as environmental activists we want to see, like that transition, and we're not saying like, oh, we should just kick Exxon out tomorrow.
Yeah, I think like the reason why we are still like investing in these companies is because we see them as a major business opportunity, and so you can see that like it's still this constant prioritization of the economy over the environment, and this desire not to transition away from an economy that is pollutive. And also like I think we need to like at least like start that narrative, start envisioning a different kind of economy that we can work on. Like, even if we don't exactly like start working on the actions, right? At least start having that conversation and idea, which is not really there right now.
Yeah.
And also, I feel like, oh yes, sorry. I feel like it's like this like hyperbole, right? That a lot of people always say it, like, oh, so the whole economy will crash. And personally, like looking at our 26 recommendations, I think they are quite reasonable, and that I don't think they'll cause the economy to crash. But anyway, like I do acknowledge that it's quite a common narrative in pragmatic Singapore. Like government official, I heard a government official who said yesterday, like, so you say you want to go back to the Stone Age and like get rid of everything.
Name names. I'm kidding. No, don't name names. Yeah.
And then like also like I think like also personal like family friends also like think sometimes like what I'm talking about is like crazy, like also like you don't want to use all your paper, pen, computer. And then I think also another minister who I cannot say in the newspaper last time, he said like so you don't want to get rid of all your phones, that kind of thing. So like I think it's quite a common thing in Singapore, but I feel like it's painting a false binary, right, between the economy and the environment. Like what we are calling for is a just transition to, like what Kate said just now, to a new future. We're calling for a steady transition as well. I think like this links back to Students for Fossil Free Future, Fossil Fuel University's report. They called for short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures, and then they also called for overall our the goal that we want to reach is full divestment by 2030. And so this is what we are looking at and calling for. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So this is the poster I see in the lift, right? In Triple S. This is the one you're talking about, right, Terese? The students for yeah, I think it's there. Yeah. Okay,
That's
so
what.
I have two responses, right? One to Kate, one to Terese, right? So Kate, you said that us climate activists are responsible, right? Well, I have three words that I want to discuss later. Just stop oil. We'll discuss that in a while, right? Then Terese, right? If I could push you a little, right? So this when people talk about the economy, they are not talking about the economy, which is an abstract concept, right? Because depressions, as an economic depressions, kill people as well, right? Depressions kill, recessions take away lives as well, right? I remember the
Yeah.
first year of COVID, there were more deaths by suicide in Singapore than there were by through COVID, right? So how will you respond to that? Like when people are talking about economy, it's not that they don't care about the environment. They are talking about the economy precisely because they care about lives.
Yeah, but I also feel like the current economy in itself is not also doing very well. It's not healthy. Like even if it's some people are definitely like benefiting from it, there's also a very large proportion of it who may not have their voices amplified also that, and also like for example vulnerable communities who are suffering also at this in this economy.
Just to add on to that, I also think that's a very like from a developed country perspective, like yeah, we're suffering like during COVID, during recessions, but what we don't understand is countries like Pakistan, they had floods earlier this year and literally 1/3 of their country was underwater. Like that is just a crazy statistic. And eventually Singapore could reach that point if we're not taking action fast enough.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
fact that also like people, like begging for funds, right, from like developed nations. Like why wasn't structures there already that help them to access these funds quickly and making them also accessible to save lives, as many lives as possible. Like all these shows deep gaps in our economic system, and something needs to change. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that was a good answer. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are some countries, all countries will suffer from climate change, but some will suffer even more, right? So countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, and you can think about Maldives and those countries are even more vulnerable, right? Okay, thank you so much. So let's get to the spicier questions, if we could, right? So there's a perception, and it's not perception. I share this sometimes as well, you know. So that climate activism can be quite performative, right? So when you use I know, Kate, your own Instagram is bring your own bottle, right? By the
Yeah.
way, I started like really actively bringing my own bottle after I saw your Instagram. Like before this, I was quite laissez-faire. Really, I was quite laissez-faire. Like, oh, I just bought it. But anyway, so you know, plastic straws is huge, right? Especially among people your generation. Like the aversion to plastic straws, right? But yet they will buy an iPhone every year. They'll buy new clothes every week, and then they'll use the aircon 24/7, right? So I don't use the aircon at home unless there are guests, right? So even when I sleep, so I think I've earned the right to use plastic straws for 2 or 3 years. So how would you agree with that strand of criticism where there's a lot of climate activism, right, which is very performative, and it's very easy to jump on the bandwagon, but it's harder to sacrifice the things that really matter to us?
Yeah, I've seen a lot, like especially a lot of young people who talk about climate and say they care, but when you see their actions, it really doesn't reflect. And I think you gave like all the examples. There was also like some OCBC study from last year or this year that actually found that Gen Zs fare the worst in climate action.
Oh,
So that's actually it's not surprising to me when I see like the way my friends or even myself sometimes like live or like a certain lifestyle. I think that being said, we need to be very clear that like sometimes individual action really isn't enough to shift the kind of systemic
Sure.
action we need, right? Like the entire concept of a carbon footprint, that was actually started by the fossil fuel industry because it shifts the burden to individuals rather than
Absolutely.
these Yeah, and so, I mean, I still feel like people have to try their best, especially if you live in a country like Singapore, where a lot of these things are accessible, and it is very possible, like for people who are in pretty privileged families. But that being said, there are still like certain gaps where, for example, you can bring your bottle out, but are there water coolers for you to get like to refill your water bottle, right? And those are infrastructure that, as one person, like I cannot change.
Yeah, and I also feel like it's not just young people or like young climate activists that also are doing these like performative kind of actions, right? Like we also see like people a lot of for example corporate people or like public officials who also don't really seem to like sometimes they do certain activities that make me like question also like how sincere also are they already caring about the environment also. And I also feel like it's important, as much as these contradictions exist, as much as we can't live perfect lives, it's important for us to be very consciously aware of it and also keep acknowledging this environmental footprint rather than choosing to remain oblivious or rather like some self-important people that I mentioned earlier, like thinking that their environmental good deeds in other areas will somehow absolve themselves of their own
Right.
responsibility contributing to this issue, right?
We have a lot of angry cops.
No,
Because
no.
to give some context, I'm spilling tea right here, but basically someone said like, oh, if I'm crafting policies for Singapore's environment, then I can use however many straws I want. Whereas my perspective is, why can't you do both?
Yeah.
Especially,
Do both.
yeah.
Like it just makes me like scratch my head, right? And like are you really looking at the pragmatic impact of like every single thing you do, or are you really like doing things because you speaking from the heart, because you really care about it from your heart? And so also like I think, for example, like although almost all of us like took planes here, right? I also argue that some of us deserve more than others to on that carbon emission, because like for example like maybe like from the climate activist perspective, personal carbon emissions, like why do I still choose to fly? For me, like for us, I feel like this is not an ordinary conference. This is a conference that's very close for an issue that's very close to my heart. It's more of an emergency gathering. It's a deafening call for action, like a rally to remind ourselves of what we need to do right now, rather than pushing the issue away. And I feel like these should also be the same reasons that everyone at COP is here for. But of course, reality is different. And also, I now know of many people who are here to find like business networks to get one more thing on their CV, or perhaps the worst of all, like for example, some fossil fuel delegates to stall climate negotiations so that they can hold on to their money. And for this group of people, I really think that it's a waste of carbon emissions and they should just get out of here. Like the climate is too urgent already to continue fretting about personal ego, to continue being preoccupied with our self-interest. And yes, I think also it shows us the whole idea of like climate inequality, right? How some people don't think twice about their habits that break this planet, and how self-important people absolve themselves of their disproportionate complicity in this crisis.
Wow, that was wonderful, right? Okay, yeah, that deserves a high five. That was excellent. Okay, so point taken. I think you're right. As in, ultimately, the corporate greenwashing and governments also do this performative thing, and we need to hold them accountable because ultimately the structures are what matter. But also we can do both, right? Individual responsibility. I talked about bringing my own bottle because of your Instagram handle. Like I try to buy fewer clothes because of Chiyun's stuff, like what she says. She says what she's a proud what something the phrase clothes repeater or something. That's the phrase she uses. Yeah. So I have been positively influenced by you guys. So thank you so much. Okay, so still on the same track. Okay, so I find that there is a certain form of condescension, not from the two of you. The two of you are extremely enlightened, So, but there is a certain form of condescension from a lot of climate activists, right? And I even find this in Greta Thunberg, to be honest, like the way like she speaks, right? So, is it true? Is it fair to say that climate activists tend to be condescending?
What do you mean by condescending though?
Oh, who's doing the interview here? Like,
You have to be a dialogue. You have to be one way.
fair enough, fair enough. Okay. All right. So do you think they speak to others from a sense of moral superiority, right? Which is, I guess, in some ways, it's not wrong, right? Because if you have a position, you must believe your position is superior, right? But do you believe that they go further than they should, right? Like they are speaking to people, hey, you guys are stupid, you guys are immoral, like be like us. We are smarter, we are more enlightened, we are more moral than you guys.
I think Terese and I were talking about this just now, and I found that like over the years, my approach to activism is not just telling people, oh, you have to do this. I think it's more of being like, here's what I'm doing for the environment, and this is why I'm doing it. And then kind of how you do like a ripple effect. I think that's how it works in the Singapore context. That being said, for people like Greta, who you find condescending to like governments or corporates, I think all I have to say is like, maybe, but I think it's totally justified because
So, yeah, I think being condescending to governments and corporate organizations, I think that's fine. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But to ordinary people who maybe use plastic straws, that's my concern. Yeah.
okay.
I feel like personally, the environmental movement focuses a lot on like solidarity, right? Solidarity with people we never seen before, or solidarity we never know, but who are suffering the worst impacts of the climate crisis, right? So I think like with that kind of mindset or the kind of back of the mind concern, I feel like if we have this kind of mindset, then we wouldn't really go take an approach of like condescension towards other people, but rather like a position of like love and in our advocacy instead. And also I feel like that I don't think it's very appropriate also if for activism to be about like yourself, like for example focusing on like my ideas are the best, and then I think like that form of condescension is very much unwarranted, and it will not solve the climate change at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not. Sorry, carry on, Terese. Yeah.
Like that being said, I think it's more often that we see the opposite is true instead. That there are more cases of people in corporates or governments, because they are at such an elite level, right? And like they're not really like on the ground as often as us, being more condescending towards like climate activists rather than the other way around. And we actually faced that a few times in the conference. And like
what was the response?
Too idealistic, too inexperienced, and yet let's face it, this current system, which is like built by these experienced and pragmatic people, is so thoroughly problematic.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that was an excellent answer. You know, this governments and corporations always will use that, right? They'll say, "Oh, you're too idealistic." I wonder also how that became a legitimate criticism. At which point in human history you're too idealistic? Like, isn't it good like to have ideals and to have like why is that a criticism? Why are you not idealistic, right? Why are you comfortable with the status quo, right? So I definitely agree. I think governments especially, they like to come from a point of view where they say, oh, you guys don't have the data, you guys are in your own bubbles, the standard one. But about activists, right? I don't think climate activists are the only one who can fall into this trap of self-importance. I think I see this amongst activists in general. And I think even if I were to be honest myself, like from time to time, I have to check myself, because we have a tendency to self-aggrandize our own importance, right? So yeah, I think it's what the two of you said is really useful. Thank you so much. Yeah. So do you think climate activists, especially now, sorry, do you want to say something?
Oh yeah, like actually, like personally on my environmental journey, I not that I've been out there for very long, maybe like 2 or 3 years, but I feel like I've seen a change in myself also, right? Like from in the initial part of it, I think like there's a lot of feelings of like despair or like wanting to find big solutions that can like solve climate change, and then it's like wanting to like think of like big ideas. I can solve climate change with this one big solution. I've also seen this same kind of mindset also in some people who are like new to the climate movement. But like I think as time went by, like I realized that solutions lie in like people power, like lies in community and community solidarity, and like finding solutions from people on the ground and from people who have been like marginalized, for example. So like I feel like that newfound knowledge also helps to act as a constant check to me, like to make sure that like I'm not talking about myself, but rather like talking for like the people that I am supposed to be standing in solidarity with. Yeah.
I think especially, sorry, because like at COP, right, we're surrounded by people from every single country. And I think coming from Singapore, we are aware that we come from a very privileged position. And I mean, Singapore is still considered developing country at the UN level, right? But we know it's not true. And so we come here and then we listen to people really talk about how they've like lost their homes or lost their culture and families because of climate change. And I think it's just very important to be aware of like the position that we are in. And we're not being here and like talking about climate justice like we've really experienced it. Because I think the truth is that we, or at least I haven't necessarily like have a lived experience of it. And so it's very important to just like listen and give them that space to share about their experiences. And then we take that home as an experience and share that with our own communities, like in Singapore as well.
Right. So it goes to what Fadila she asked. Do you think that people who are most impacted by the climate crisis are sufficiently represented at forums like COP?
I think it's changing. Civil society space is definitely opening up at COPs. And we see like there's a lot of indigenous representation here. I think still not as much as there should be, but it is. This year there was like a children and youth pavilion, which is the first time in COP's history that they've actually done that. There's also a climate justice pavilion, which is also the first one. So this COP was like full of milestones like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but like I think like in a panel yesterday, Kate was like saying how there's still so much more fossil fuel delegates than the top 10
most vulnerable countries. Like the number of oil and gas lobbyists here at COP outweigh the number of delegates from top 10 most vulnerable countries.
Wow. What
Yeah,
what are some of these most vulnerable countries? Do you guys have?
There's actually like a number from Southeast Asia. So probably like Philippines, Vietnam, and then South Asia as well, Bangladesh.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So Liana says that hope is still important in response to what you guys said. I will go one step further. I would say hope is all we have. The moment we lose hope, we lose life itself, you know. So are climate activists losing support, you think, based on how people like to judge by extremes, right? And you see Just Stop Oil in the UK, and in fact public sentiment even in UK has sort of turned right against many of this, even though in general people in the UK, they are not like in the US where there are climate deniers or whatever it is. So generally you have the population does believe in climate change and they are supportive of it, but these things do for those who are unaware, the Just Stop Oil, they were protesting and shutting down roads and so on, and it was difficult for people to just carry on with their daily lives. Do you guys get a sense that, so is this talked about even in the activist circles, or is this something far removed, happens in the UK and it's a one-off and it doesn't happen in the other parts of the world?
No, I think it's definitely talked about, especially among like young activists here. And something that's come up for a lot of us is, why did Stop Oil have to resort to such a action? Because it's not like they just wake up one day and say, let's block the roads. It's probably the fact that they were just repeatedly shut down over and over again that they feel they have to resort to this, because they weren't given the right avenues to voice their thoughts in the first place. And I think throughout history, we've seen that civil disobedience has always been the catalyst of change. And so there are a lot of activist groups increasingly resorting to actions like that. My personal stance is that why are we more concerned? For example, they threw tomato soup at a painting, right? And people got so angry over it. And I understand it was an expensive painting, but why are we more concerned about the painting than the fact that an entire country, one third of it was underwater? Like, it just seems so unbalanced in my mind. I know that strategy will not work in Singapore, but I still feel like if it works for them in those countries, and if it's really like being brought the media attention, that was the ultimate like aim of it anyway, to get the media attention so that they can talk about climate crisis, then I don't think we have a right to kind of judge them and say you shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, I also feel like even though to some extent, yes, it may have like tainted the idea of like climate activism as a whole. I feel like it's also important to not see like climate activists as like one monolithic or homogeneous group, right? Like activism lies on a spectrum. Activism is dynamic. And activism is so responsive to the social cultural conditions that is situated within, right? So, like for example, what I may not personally agree with, or be willing to do the same actions as just the oil. Like what Kate said, do I have to judge them? Perhaps their actions did work to some extent in their own home countries, and perhaps they have been in not multiple times by people in authority, or perhaps they were have some personal painful experiences because of climate change. Like for example, over here in COP, I've heard about how indigenous peoples telling their stories about how they saw their fathers, mothers, children die in front of their eyes. And so my point is that like there are so many different types of activism and shaped by the different and birthed and shaped by the different social cultural forces that they are placed in. And so then like for me, as long as they are non-violent, I see no reason why I should point fingers and say that this type of activism is wrong, ineffective, or inferior in any way.
So I just want to emphasize that Kate and Terese are talking about civil disobedience in other countries, okay? So for whoever is watching,
Yeah.
they are not calling for it in Singapore, okay? So,
Yeah, and
okay, so, carry on.
like as a Singaporean activist, we know that a lot of these strategies from overseas cannot be translated in our own country. Like you don't see us doing this in Singapore, and
Yeah.
I don't think we were there to in
Yeah,
the first place.
and also to be honest, I do acknowledge that there are a lot of platforms also for us to like engage with our ministers, whereas more than other countries maybe. Like for example, we have been invited to like dialogues before with ministers of the National Climate Change Secretariat of PMO. And so on. So we do recognize these opportunities so we can make our voice heard, even though we feel like it should be ramped up a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a combination of comments from Rebecca, whom Terese knows very well, and from Steffi, who's the one who's helping me out with Teh Tarik. She's the one who does my YouTube stuff. So Rebecca says that she doesn't think it works in the UK though. NGL, not gonna lie. I know what that means. Okay, so I'm studying in London now from Steffi, and I don't know what XR is. And Just Talk All really changing what people think of climate activism. And Steffi goes on to say, you can say, why do we care more about a painting? But when people from XR are stopping people from getting to work because of their activism, it's not a good look. And Rebecca also said it could be violence against culture, which I think shouldn't be downplayed. And I agree with that as well, right? So it's not just a painting, right? A painting represents a lot of things, especially if it's something that society has decided that this represents the pinnacle of artistic creativity in our civilization or whatever it is, right? So if you're gonna destroy, even though it's inanimate, but it represents something, right? So let's say it's something like this, right? If there's a painting of Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and you pour something on it, right? It's gonna get a lot of Singaporeans riled up. Never mind that if there's a Singapore flag or a country's flag, right? It's an inanimate thing, but it symbolizes so much, right? So would you see why people are upset?
I think it's a fair point. I personally cannot resonate with the painting. I feel like blocking roads and the tube, like that one could be extreme. But yeah, like if Steffi is living in London and if she's like personally experiencing this and feels that form of activism doesn't work, then I think that's more accurate than anything we've said.
Yeah, Rebecca's in UK as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Rebecca is there as well. I forgot about that. Yeah. Okay.
No,
So XR, Extinction Rebellion, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I also need like more context as to understanding what the painting is about and like what is symbolized. Like for example, I think not really climate related, but I think there was like some people who in the UK or is it the US who like destroying statues of people who symbolize racism in the past or something like that. So like even though yes they may have done a lot of things to help to develop the country and develop the state, like these remaining statues of them give people a lot of like bad memories of the racial injustices that have trickled down until today also, right? So like I feel like I need more context to understanding the cultural significance and of that painting. So
Okay, thank you. I mean, I don't want to talk about race because then we will have to extend for 1 hour already. So, so okay, thank you so much. So, what would you want the Singapore government to do that they are not doing now? That you think? Oh, by the way, before I get to that question, so Terese, you mentioned that in Singapore you have a lot of opportunities. You get invited to COP. You know, you sit at dialogues with ministers and MPs. And how sure are you that's not a form of co-optation? And how sure are you that people in the UK, they can just email their MP and their MPs reply immediately, right? And they have far more outlets. Wouldn't you say so? Just because you get invited more to dialogues with policymakers, what makes you think that your impact is higher?
yeah, definitely I can't really like say my impact is higher or anything, but like I think it's very important also for me to like listen to both sides, right? Like to both listen to the policymakers, but also keep very close connection to the voices on the ground. Voices not only from my own organization like SYCA, Singapore Youth for Climate Action, but also like voices from SG Climate Rally or voices from S4F, the Students for Fossil Free Future, and so all these diverse voices in the climate movement are also very important, and all these different voices on different aspects of the whole spectrum of activism, right? And all the different ideas. So I feel like that helps to keep me aware and conscious.
Critical.
Yeah, and critical also.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't think anyone should ever turn down an invitation to engage with policymakers. Not ever, but sometimes, I mean, you do it out of strategy, right? But I think as long as you have a chance to engage, you should engage, right? I really think it's a mistake to not go to the table and bang table if you have to, but still accept the invitation, right? So there's a comment by N1R1. The world's leading polluter of plastics in 2021 is the official sponsor of COP. Is that true? I mean, I don't know. And what do you think of that? Yeah.
A fun story is that at the start, when Coca-Cola was a sponsor, it got huge backlash, like across every major media outlet. And then in the last week, we saw them slowly covering all the Coca-Cola logos here. So I'm not really sure if they are still sponsoring it, but I do think it was just a very bad choice on the Egyptian presidency's part in choosing Coca-Cola. Yeah, because it goes completely against the values here.
Yeah. I mean, I think the Egyptian president, to be fair, has made far bigger mistakes than choosing Coca-Cola to be the... but I'll leave it there because the two of you are still in Egypt. Okay, so now that you've had the chance to be exposed to other government stances to climate change, how would you summarize the Singapore government's position? And that was going to be my question as well. What do you want the government to do from now on?
I think the government's position is like a very Singaporean thing, right? Like we just choose what fits our national interest best. And to be fair, I don't think it's just Singapore. I think everyone can do that. In terms of like, there was this, like someone once said this to me, which is that Singapore doesn't have environmental policies. We just have economic policies that happen to be good for our environment. And I think to some extent that is true, even though it's shifting a bit, but at the end of the day, it's still like GDP, economy, pragmatism as the like baseline. Yeah.
Terese?
Oh, yeah. So we have like we had this green group meetup where we met up with we have a virtual meetup with the different environmental groups in Singapore, and then after that we or their inputs on what kind of recommendations they like to see in the government's current policies or like corporate's current policies also. And then we finally like synthesized it to 26 recommendations in the different themes. Yeah, so I think that's the main.
It's a policy
Oh,
paper. Yeah.
okay. So, and they can find this on the Instagram page.
Yeah. It's one of our top posts.
Okay,
Um,
yeah.
Can I highlight like certain policies?
Carry on. Yeah.
I think one of them is carbon tax, which I wanted to bring up because it was debated in Parliament like last week. And right now there's the bill that was, or the act that was just passed. There's a part that gives fossil fuel companies allowances in the carbon tax, meaning the minister can kind of say, okay, these companies, like, you are exempted from the carbon tax for a certain period of time. And I think that just goes against the principles of like a fair or uniform tax, because you don't really want to give these countries a free pass, right? It's also the fact that the allowances are very non-transparent, so we don't know why they are being given to who or for how long. And so that was something that kind of came out in Parliament, although both parties supported having allowances. But I think from an environmental perspective, it's very difficult to be able to like accept it or see the need for it when we aren't given any information about it.
Yeah, I think also at the start, just now we were talking about like carbon credits, right? So right now, companies, even though they're all made to pay the carbon tax, which we've heard, right, is increasing $25 or something like that. Yeah, I think you need to go and like Google to check out more exactly on what the exact carbon tax is. But like there's actually a 5% allowance though for companies to trade off for carbon credits instead also, and there's not a lot of transparency into like which companies are doing this and how much also they are doing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So a lack of transparency, like, I think I've heard that before for other areas in Singapore's public policy as well. Okay, so let's end on a conciliatory note, right? So which member of parliament or politician that you guys have found to be most amenable to your suggestions or your critiques or your policy proposals, if any? You can choose to say, oh, there's nobody, right? Nobody really cares about this. Oh, yeah, if any.
I think it's quite straightforward for me, which is MP Louis Ng from PAP. He's been championing for like environmental stuff since the start. And we did a data analysis before of all the PQs, like environmental related PQs that MPs asked. And he like by far just wins the entire thing. Like so many PQs from him about environment. He's also the one who just kept pushing for a higher carbon tax, for net zero. And so I think he's been very consistent throughout the years.
But that being said, also like in our policy workshop, we like, because we have this like conversations with like data-building people about like also which is the parliamentarian that is most championing environmental issues, and a lot of people only know Louis Ng. And also like for me, I find that a bit like problematic also. Like we need to know more diverse faces within our parliament also, so we can like push for diverse faces who speak on certain environmental policies. So like which topic is under whom and so on. And so I feel like having this idea of like who speaks on what, right, helps us also to make more targeted policy recommendations towards these people, and also have to like put like some kind of pressure on them to advocate on this policy which they are more interested in. Although like most of them are also very much economic and pragmatic related kind of environmental policies.
Oh, but I also have to add, I feel like the Sengkang MPs have been doing a good job of raising more climate related issues. Yeah.
So
Like
the three current Sengkang MPs, right? Yeah.
So Potengru, James, Lim, and
Look, yeah, okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. So I mean no disagreements there. Louis Ng also happens to be the only sitting PAP MP who has come on this show. So the other PAP folks were all retired. So other than Louis, is there anybody from the PAP, from the government especially? I remember you posted something before, Kate, about I can't remember who, but someone from the PAP who you said always listen to you, even sometimes when you disagree with him.
Oh, yeah. Desmond Tan. From
Okay.
Pasir Ris. So he was actually at first in MSE as a Minister of State, and then they moved him to NTUC. And then it was, yeah, I was very sad because I felt like he really listened or like made the effort to learn about what environmental groups wanted. Yeah.
Like sometimes you can feel that like some of these ministers or like public officials who are making like environmental policies, like they like to they assure us that, oh yes, we do care about the environment, but sometimes I wonder, like, do they care about it like beyond the policy making level? Do they care about like on the personal level? Like, were they
Why does that
really
matter to
like,
you? Why does that matter to you?
because like
I'm
it's
thinking
like,
because you mentioned this earlier also, right? And then I'm thinking, who cares, right? I mean, I don't care. Like, what you can be. I mean, you can be a personal bigot all you want, right? But as a politician, if you enact policies which are multiracial, multicultural, that's all I care about, right? Because your personal bigotry will not affect me if your public policy is sound, right? And is our focus on trying to go for the goodness of a politician's heart? Ultimately, that's going to fail us, right? Because shouldn't we just go for institutions and public pressure that will force even bad people to do the right things, and not rely on this what do you call it, a black swan of a good-hearted person, right? Whoever this person is, to suddenly save us, right?
yeah. I also
Yeah.
I feel like they're intrinsically related, right? Like how your personality is, it also feed into the kind of policies that you make, right? Like for example, in politics, we learn about how narcissistic people or paranoid people will affect the kind of very egoistic policies that they make that prioritize like their own personal considerations over like their national interests as well. So I feel like they're still intrinsically related, and although it's ideal that we have institutions that prevent such personalities from like seeping into the policies that you make, it's also unrealistic to expect that like they will completely be like personality free.
Okay, I'm gonna disagree with Terese on this one because, like, personally, I feel like my interest is not really in the environment per se. Like, there are people who care about trees or about nature, and I feel like I never really had that inherent connection. Whereas for me, it's more of like a logical thing where I see the climate crisis happening and I see how people are affected by it, and that's what I care more about. And so for me, it's less important that politicians care like about the environment. Like, you don't really have to love nature, but what I expect is at least to be open-minded to civil society groups and to at least hear those perspectives and take that into consideration in your policy making.
Right.
Yeah,
So that's carry on.
for me, I feel like I have this like innate feeling of like connection to nature. But like, yeah, I agree with Kate in that like, I feel like politicians should also care about nature, should also be connected to the environment. Like I feel like everybody should be connected to the environment because we are all from the environment, and and I feel like that should also affect the way they create their policies.
Right.
Yes.
So I know Terese not super well, but well enough, to know that she means every word she said, and she is really that person. She's a good person, good-hearted person, right? But I don't expect to vote for a politician who's like Terese, right? Like someone like Terese. I mean, and you also said about egos, right? A person who doesn't have an ego probably would not be inclined to joining politics to begin with, right? There's a selection bias in terms of those. So I guess, I mean, I'll just end off this particular segment on that note, right? I don't find the focus on finding good-hearted people fruitful. And also, how do I know whether you're a good-hearted person? How do I know that? There's just no way for me to know. I can only judge by what I see, right? And the other thing is, I suppose, you can be good before you get power, but after you get power, then that's a different matter altogether, right? Not that power changes you, but it reveals who you are, right? Like before you had power, you didn't have an opportunity to show that you're a douchebag, but now you have power. Then you have. Okay, final words from Terese and Kate. Anything you guys want to say?
You go first.
You go first.
Okay, I just want to say, we've been called idealistic so many times throughout this conference, and I just want to address that and say that I think what is idealistic is when you think you can conquer Mother Nature with metal and technology, and when you think you can bend the laws of nature, because it really is not possible. And I think climate change will come to Singapore one way or another, and you cannot like finance your way out of it. And so we're definitely going to have to like take action fast enough to prevent that situation.
Yeah, and for me, I want to say that like even though we're at COP here, like I feel like real action happens outside of COP, it happens on the ground. And so I feel like when we go back and like I feel that we need to like for not just us but like all Singaporeans, we need to like have more discussions about the environment and more honest and open ways also, like for just politicians, day-to-day people, like everybody as a whole of society. Yeah.
Thank you. I know I keep saying last point, but then there's a question by Fadila. Is there any piece of literature that you can recommend that has been effective in helping people understand the reality of climate change? Any particular book or article or website?
I really like Naomi Klein. Her last name is Klein, and she's an author from Canada. I find her work very, very inspiring.
I feel like for me, the literature that I consume is like constantly changing. Also, like I used to read a lot of The Guardian used to have this newsletter called The Green Light, and then like I think I think I read it like almost every day, and like during when I was like 17 or 18, and I feel like that reading that really helped to shape my perspectives of the environment, like both not just at a local level but also from in the international one. And yeah, it really like shaped my environmental principles and how I grew also as a person. But at the same time, I think that newsletter is like out of date already. So I think really there's no one fixed newsletter that will best work. Rather, you find something that you can connect with and that speaks to you from the heart. Yeah. Okay.
Kate, Terese, thank you so much. You mentioned, Kate, that Naomi Klein was inspiring. I found this conversation, honest to God, I found it inspiring, and I hope you continue to be idealistic, you know, and it always, when I talk to you, it gives me hope, you know, in young people, but of course, when I talk to other young people, it gives me despair, but hopefully there's more, hopefully there's more of you out there than the people who cause me despair. Thank you so much for coming on this show, and thank you for kicking off this season to a great start. Okay. Sorry? Yeah, of course.
Well, are you idealistic?
Yeah,
because I class you say that like as you grow older you become less idealistic.
You are right. So I think I am idealistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. But for sure, if I compare myself to, I think if I compare myself to the median Singaporean, probably I'm a bit more idealistic. But I compare myself to when I was your age, for sure I become maybe not less idealistic, because I didn't mention that specifically. I mentioned that I became more cowardly, if you remember. It's even worse. As you grow older, you become less bold. I mentioned that. I find that true for myself, right? Which is why someone really wise said this before, you know. So the wisdom of the old must be tempered by the enthusiasm of the young must be tempered by the wisdom of the old, you know. So if you're older, you're wiser, but you are more scared, you're less bold. When you're younger, you're less wise, but you are very brave, you want to push boundaries. So you must try to find this middle ground, right? And that's the sweet spot of society. I didn't come up with that, by the way. Yeah, somebody else did. Yeah.
Along those lines.
Oh yeah, sure. I don't have to sleep. Let's carry on until 1 a.m. right?
No, but I want to
because it was from like an indigenous perspective, and I think a lot of times we feel like older people don't care, but I think it's not true. And it basically says the youth run the fastest, but the elders know the path. And I like you need a bit of both at the end of the day.
Oh my gosh. Wait, I just spark off something. Sorry, I need to say something. I think that climate action also isn't just like a youth kind of envisioning thing. It's something that is intergenerational. I've seen like old people, middle-aged people also keep talking about the solutions that they have and the ideas that they have. So I feel like it's really intergenerational partnership that we need to do, and also a lot of solutions that we have to like environmental issues can also be found in like indigenous knowledge, in the knowledge of our great grandfathers, our great grandmothers, and so on. And I feel like that's what we need to revive, rather than trying to invest $1 million in a new technology that we don't know whether will work, and then after to use a lot of resources, energy, and everything, and then like I think I should.
No, that's true. I find that even the Singapore solution is always, what is the technology what is the new technology, right? So excellent. I think that is a really good way to end the session, because you guys talked about this intergenerational coalition, right? I find that is true for race activism. I think while you wanna push for more honest discussions, you must also be wise enough to never alienate the majority, because otherwise it's not going to go anywhere. And I think for climate action as well, it's always good to get people on your side. And doesn't mean you have to censor yourself, but maybe sometimes there's just a wiser way of saying or doing things, right? So thank you so much. I won't ask you do you have any more comments, because then I'm sure you guys still have more comments.
Stop here before we continue.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.